Welcome to my channel. Tonight we slip into a lamplit room where clay dust hangs in the air like flour in a sleepy bakery. And the only sound is a reed stylus scratching soft lines into wet tablets, while the city outside breathes in slow, warm waves. You are standing close enough to feel the heat from a little oil lamp, close enough to smell damp earth and ink made from soot, and close enough to notice something strange about the words taking shape. Some parts of what you are about to hear are widely accepted history, the everyday reality of Sumerian cities and their scribes. Some parts are interpretation, the way later readers try to understand old symbols. And some parts are calm. What if imagination, the kind you can safely hold, like a smooth pebble in your palm, while you drift toward sleep? This might sound intense, and you probably won't survive this, meaning your tidy, modern sense of time might not make it out in one piece. But you will be fine. Your pillow will still be loyal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and your local time, because I like picturing all of us listening under different skies. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch the scribe press the stylus down, lift it, turn the angle, press again. The marks are wedge-shaped, neat as if the clay itself wants to be organized. Most historians agree that these tablets were the paperwork of real life. Receipts, contracts, lists of grain, letters, prayers, hymns, and little snapshots of law and labor. This is the solid ground, the part you can walk on without wobbling. Sumer is not a floating myth. It is mud brick walls, canals, barley fields, and people arguing over boundaries like humans have always done. Probably with the same tired tone you use when someone takes your parking spot. The city around you feels awake, even when it is quiet. Somewhere a donkey complains with the dramatic energy of an online review. Somewhere a baby cries, a pot clinks, a door scrapes. You are in the kind of world where writing is a technology so new that it still feels like magic. And the person holding that magic is not a wizard, just an exhausted professional with a sore wrist. You lean closer. You cannot read the marks yet, not in your modern brain, but you can feel the intention. This tablet is going to matter. It will harden in the sun. It will be stored. It might be copied. It might be broken, buried, dug up, shipped, translated, argued over, and used as a mirror by people who want it to say something about them. That is one of the secrets of ancient texts. They do not stay still. They sit there quietly, while each century walks in and asks, "So what do you mean for me, mean?" The idea in the title is that Sumerian texts reveal we are trapped in an eternal cycle of rebirth. Let's hold that gently, because the evidence is complicated. The evidence we do have points to Sumerians thinking in cycles all the time. Not necessarily because they believed your soul jumps into a new body like a traveler changing cloaks, but because the world they lived in was a wheel. Rivers rise and fall. Planting becomes harvest. Then emptiness. Then planting Okin. Kings rule, then die. Then another king sits. Then that king becomes a name on a list. Even a city can fall and rise again, repaired, rebuilt, and sometimes renamed, but still haunted by the same streets. One interpretation is that when later readers hear the word rebirth, they imagine reincarnation, a literal return of a personal soul. A more cautious explanation could be that the ancient language is pointing to recurring order rather than returning individuals. To be clear, this is debated. Ancient Mesopotamian religion does talk about the dead, about an underworld, about offerings for ancestors, about spirits that can be restless. But the idea of a neat karmic loop is not something most historians describe as a standard Sumerian doctrine. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you are here for the feeling of the puzzle, and for the way the old world keeps tapping the glass of your modern life. So you let your mind settle into this room, and you watch the tablet become a doorway. The scribe is not writing a myth right now. He is writing an account of barley, or a list of workers, or the allocation of beer. And yes, beer shows up a lot, because nothing says civilization like inventing writing and immediately using it to manage snacks and paychecks. You can almost picture a supervisor in a courtyard saying, "We must track the bread rations," and the scribe thinking, "Ah yes, the ancient version of spreadsheets, my favorite." But hidden inside these ordinary lines is a worldview. That worldview says the city is a living thing. The temple is the heart. The storehouse is the stomach. The fields are the lungs. And the people are the bloodstream. Every year, the city must be renewed through ritual and work, or it risks dissolving back into chaos. Archaeology suggests that temple institutions organized labor and resources in ways that shaped daily life. That is mainstream history. In that mainstream picture, you can already sense a cycle: plant, harvest, store, distribute, repair canals, dredge silt, rebuild walls. A flood damages the fields. The community rallies. Order is restored. The wheel turns again. Now, the mystery angle slides in softly. What if the cycle is not just agriculture and administration, but a story about you, the listener, caught in patterns you cannot see while you live them? What if the tablet is not only a record, but a metaphor for the way you rewrite yourself over and over? You look at the scribe's hands. His fingers are stained with clay, the nails chipped. He has done this 1,000 times. He has pressed the same shapes into the same material until it becomes muscle memory. And that is where the idea of an eternal cycle starts to feel personal. Because you do the same. You wake, you work, you worry, you rest, you repeat. You call it routine. You call it life. But one interpretation is that the ancients, staring at their own routines, built stories that made repetition feel meaningful rather than suffocating. In Sumer, repetition is not a flaw. It is a structure. The calendar is a loop. The New Year festival renews the city's relationship with the divine order. Kingship is framed as something bestowed, maintained, and reaffirmed. When the world seems unstable, you do the rituals again. You speak the words again. You rebuild again. The evidence we do have points to a strong cultural emphasis on maintaining order against disorder, often symbolized as the difference between the cultivated land and the wild steppe. Now your mind drifts toward that word, order, as if it is a blanket. Imagine you are walking through a street of mud brick houses. The air smells like baked clay and smoke. You pass a courtyard where a woman kneads dough, and a child chases a chicken with the dedication of someone who has no bills and no emails. A dog sleeps in the shade, unbothered. the true spiritual master. The city hums, and above it all rises the temple complex, a place where humans and gods are thought to meet in daily exchange. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian temples were central institutions, not just for worship, but for economy and governance. That is documented. And in that documented world, the gods are not distant. They are administrators of reality, powerful forces tied to storm, river, fertility, justice, and kingship. The city's job is to keep them satisfied, because satisfied gods mean stable seasons, predictable floods, and fewer catastrophes. And yet, in the cracks between those practical concerns, a question flickers. If the gods maintain order, and order is cyclical, then is your life also a cycle maintained by something beyond you? That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not hand you a simple statement like, "You personally will be reborn forever." Instead, they show you a world where continuity matters, where the line of descent matters, where the city's survival matters, and where time is experienced as returning patterns rather than a straight line shooting into the unknown. A popular rumor claims that ancient Mesopotamian texts hide a secret doctrine of reincarnation. But that theory isn't widely accepted, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It becomes a mood more than a claim, a way to listen to the old words without forcing them to say what you already believe. You watch the scribe pause. He blows softly on the tablet to dry a line. He glances toward a supervisor, perhaps, or a priest, or a merchant. Someone is waiting for this record to be complete. And you realize something quietly eerie. Writing is a way of freezing a moment so it can return. A spoken word disappears. A written word waits. Later, someone reads it, and the moment is reborn inside their mind. If you want an eternal cycle, there it is. Not in a mystical wheel of souls, but in the humble fact that a thought can be carried forward. Die in silence, then live again when eyes meet marks. You let that land softly. You can almost feel your own thoughts doing it. You have ideas you believed as a kid, then forgot, then rediscovered. You have habits you tried to quit, then found again, like they were hiding behind a curtain. You have songs that vanish for years, then come back the moment you smell a certain soap or hear a certain chord. The cycle is not always cosmic. Sometimes it is neurological. Sometimes it is social. Sometimes it is just you being a human who owns a brain that loves loops. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of writing in Mesopotamia were primarily for economic accounting, or whether they quickly expanded into broader storytelling and administration in ways that changed society almost immediately. And while scholars debate that, you can sit in this room and feel both things at once. You can feel the tablet as a receipt, and you can feel the tablet as a spell. The scribe begins another line. You imagine what it might say. 30 jars of oil, 10 bundles of reeds, 5 workers assigned to canal cleaning. Ordinary, ordinary, ordinary. And then a name. A personal name, pressed into clay. Suddenly, it is not just economy. It is a person reaching forward. That name might be read by a stranger thousands of years later. The person is gone, but the name returns. The person is not reborn, but the trace is Now the mystery theory can tiptoe in again. What if, in some strange metaphysical sense, being remembered is a kind of rebirth? What if the ancients sensed that too? And that is why they cared so much about names, lineage, and legacy. It's possible that the fear of being forgotten shaped their rituals for the dead, their offerings, their laments. A careful reading might suggest that the underworld stories are less about moral reward and more about continuity, about keeping the bonds between living and dead from snapping completely. And you can feel the sleepiness begin to deepen, like the lamp flame lowering. Your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches. The fan hum, if you turned it on, becomes the river in the distance. Another mainstream fact settles in. Many Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts include laments for cities, poetic works mourning destruction and pleading for restoration. Most historians agree these laments reflect real experiences of war, famine, or political collapse, filtered through religious language. A city falls, and then someone hopes it will rise again. If you want a rebirth motif, you do not have to reach for cosmic reincarnation. You can watch the city itself become the thing that dies and returns. But what if the city is also you? What if the city in the text is the mind? The wall is your boundary. The canal is your attention. The temple is your center. In that cinematic what if, every time you rebuild your life after loss, you are acting out the same ancient drama, a quiet Sumerian rhythm under modern clothes. You notice the scribe's breath. In and out, in and out. Even breathing is a loop. It is so obvious you almost laugh. But you keep it gentle because this is bedtime, not a comedy club. Still, let's be honest, your body is basically a very sophisticated cycle machine that occasionally forgets why it walked into the kitchen. That's not a flaw. That's just the human operating system. The scribe finishes, and he sets the tablet aside. It will dry. It will harden. It will endure longer than his body. That is the strange bargain of writing. Your life is brief, but your marks can be stubborn. And in that stubbornness, there is comfort, and there is a faint chill. Comfort because something lasts. Chill because what lasts can repeat its influence in ways you cannot control. So when someone says Sumerian texts reveal we're trapped in an eternal cycle of rebirth, you can hear it in a careful way. You can say, the documented part is that Sumerian life was structured by cycles of season, ritual, and political renewal. You can say, the interpreted part is that rebirth might be a metaphor for restoration, continuity, and the return of order. And you can allow the imagined part to glow softly, the possibility that your own life echoes these loops, that your patterns are older than you think, that you have been pressing the same marks into your own clay in different years, in different moods, under different lamps. You stand in the lamplit room a little longer. Your fingers feel dusty, even if they are not. Your eyes feel heavier. The scribe's tablet rests like a sleeping animal, and you let yourself wonder, very gently, not as a conclusion, but as a question you can fall asleep holding. What if the cycle isn't a prison made of iron, but a rhythm made of breath, harvest, memory, and ink? What if the way you return is not by waking up in a new body, but by living the same lesson until it finally feels less sharp? And with that thought, you let the lamp dim in your mind, and you let the clay cool, and you let the world become quiet enough for sleep. You step out into night air that feels warm and grainy, as if the darkness itself is made from ground barley. The city is quieter now, but it is not asleep. Somewhere, a late worker drags a basket and mutters the ancient equivalent of, "I did not sign up for this," which, if you think about it, is basically the oldest sentence in human history. Above you, stars hang like pinpricks in a deep cloth, and the horizon is a flat line where canals and fields dissolve into the desert. Most historians agree that Sumerian cities depended on careful water management, and that the rhythm of irrigation, planting, and harvest shaped everything from diet to politics. That is the solid ground again. But tonight you are not counting barley. You are watching time itself behave like a wheel. A ziggurat rises ahead, layered and stepped, a mountain made by human hands. Archaeology suggests that such temple platforms anchored religious and civic life, visible from far across the plain, like a landmark for both bodies and thoughts. You walk toward it slowly, not because you are tired, though you probably are, but because the air feels thick with meaning. Each step on packed earth seems to press a tiny promise into the ground. Return, return, return. On the lower terraces, you find people moving in quiet purpose. A priest with a lamp, a guard leaning on a spear, trying to look intimidating while clearly wishing for bedtime. A worker carrying reeds for mats. No one is dramatic. No one is announcing mysteries with thunder. This is a place where the sacred is handled the way you handle dishes, carefully, daily, sometimes with mild annoyance. You look up. The sky is a story. The stars do not just sparkle, they measure. The moon is not just pretty, it schedules. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian societies tracked time through lunar months, and across centuries they developed ways to coordinate lunar cycles with the solar year for agricultural and ritual planning, even if the details vary by period and city. The pattern is clear. They watch the heavens because the heavens helped them survive. One interpretation is that the ancient obsession with calendars is not merely practical, but psychological. A careful reading might suggest that naming the days and months is a way to tame the fear that time is chaos. If you can count it, you can manage it. If you can predict it, you can sleep at night. And what if that is the first hint of the so-called eternal cycle? Not a supernatural trap, but a human strategy, turning uncertainty into a loop you can hold. You climb the first set of stairs. The bricks are cool under your bare feet. Or maybe you are wearing sandals, depending on how cinematic your imagination feels tonight. Either way, the ziggurat makes you slow down. It does that thing tall buildings do, where they make you feel small. Except this one also makes you feel old. Like you have walked these steps in a dream you cannot quite place. On a landing, a small group of people face the horizon. They are not praying in a way that looks like modern prayer. They are performing. They are aligning themselves with the sky, with the direction of the river, with the math of seasons. They speak words you do not fully understand, but the mood is clear. They want the world to stay in order. They want the flood to come, but not too much. They want the sun to return, but not scorch. They want the seed to sprout. They want the city to continue. This is where the cycle becomes louder. The new year is not a casual date on a wall. It is a ritual reset, a rebalancing, a public reminder that chaos is always nearby, and order must be renewed. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian kingship and temple ritual were intertwined, and that rulers often presented themselves as guardians of cosmic and social stability. A more cautious explanation could be that these ceremonies served political cohesion as much as spiritual devotion. But either way, the feeling is the same. The year dies and is reborn, again and again. Now the mystery theory slips in, but it keeps its shoes off and speaks quietly. What if the yearly reset is more than a festival? What if it is training? You practice the idea that endings are not final. You rehearse return. You teach the city to breathe through uncertainty by saying, "We have done this before. We will do it again." You reach higher terraces. The view widens. The canal glints like a thin ribbon. The fields are patched in darker and lighter rectangles. Mud brick houses cluster like a pile of sleeping animals. The city has a heartbeat, and you can almost hear it. Farther out, the desert begins, where cultivated order stops and wildness waits. The contrast is sharp and simple, like a child's drawing, but it runs deep in the Mesopotamian mind. The city is order, the steppe is risk, the river is life. The flood is danger and blessing at once. And here, under the stars, you notice something about yourself. Your brain loves to loop too. You replay conversations. You revisit regrets. You plan tomorrow. You remember yesterday. You keep circling thoughts like a dog circling a bed. Sometimes you call it anxiety. Sometimes you call it reflection. But one interpretation is that the human mind is always searching for patterns because patterns feel like safety. So when people hear eternal cycle of rebirth, it can land like a scary idea, like a trap. But what if the cycle is also a cushion? If time is a circle, you do not fall off the edge. You simply come back around to something familiar. That doesn't solve every problem, but it changes the emotional texture of living. It makes continuity possible. On the top terrace, a small shrine stands. A priest lights incense or aromatic resin, and the smoke curls upward as if it is trying to become a column to the sky. You breathe it in. It smells sharp, sweet, and earthy, like pine and dust. You feel your eyelids soften. Sleep like smells. Sleep is easily bribed. Someone nearby murmurs about omens. Not a dramatic prophecy, just the practical mindset that signs matter. A bird's flight, a weird cloud, a dog howling. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cultures developed elaborate divination practices over time, including interpreting celestial events. This is documented across later periods especially, and the roots of that mindset are older. They watched the sky, and they thought the sky watched back. Historians still argue whether early celestial observation in Mesopotamia was primarily ritual and symbolic before it became more systematically mathematical, or whether those strands were intertwined from the start. And that debate matters for our mood tonight, because it shows the tension between two ways of seeing the heavens. One is measurement, one is meaning. The cycle of rebirth can belong to either. Measurement says, the moon returns on schedule. Meaning says, the returning moon is a promise that you can return too, in some form. A fringe idea proposes that ancient temples were built with coded astronomical knowledge so advanced it must have come from outside influence. Maybe visitors, maybe gods, maybe something stranger. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers in documentaries and late-night conversations because it is fun, like a campfire story with math. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle what if. What if the ziggurat is not only a religious platform, but a time machine for the mind, a place that trains you to feel the universe as patterned and repeating? You look down at your hands. In your imagination, there is still clay dust on your fingers, but now there is also brick grit from the stairs. Different textures, same feeling. The world leaves residue on you. You carry it. You carry days, months, years. You carry routines. You carry losses. You carry little rebirths, like the moment you laugh again after a hard week. The priest begins a chant that rises and falls in a steady cadence. You do not need the words to feel the structure. It is repetitive, by design. Repetition is not laziness. It is the point. It is how you sink into a state where the mind stops racing and starts drifting. If you have ever listened to rain, you understand. Rain is repetitive, yet it never gets boring, because each drop is slightly different. That is the trick. A cycle can repeat without duplicating. A year returns, but the year is never identical. A person repeats a habit, but the feeling changes. The loop is real, but the content shifts. That is an important distinction for the theme tonight. Being in a cycle does not automatically mean being stuck. A cycle can be a spiral, where you return to familiar points, but at a slightly different height, with slightly different understanding. One interpretation is that ancient ritual cycles functioned like that, not as cages, but as scaffolding for growth. That is interpretation, not a proven fact, but it fits the way humans work. You watch the moon. It is waxing or waning, doing what it does without asking your permission. You think about how the ancients named months, how they linked them to harvest stages and festivals, and how those names anchored the year. When you name something, you can talk about it. When you can talk about it, it feels less monstrous. If time is the monster that eats everything, then a calendar is the leash you put on it, even if the leash is mostly symbolic. Now your mind wanders into the cinematic what-if zone, but it stays polite. What if the eternal cycle is not enforced by gods, but by the way memory works? You forget just enough to repeat your mistakes, but remember just enough to feel haunted by them. You fall in love with the same type of person, you chase the same goals, you fear the same endings. You call it fate. But it might just be pattern. And if it is pattern, then noticing it is already a kind of freedom. A guard yawns loudly, and you almost laugh. Even in sacred spaces, someone is bored. The divine order is impressive, but the human body still wants a nap. Honestly, that is comforting. It means you don't have to be perfect to participate in meaning. You can be sleepy, messy, and still part of the cycle. The wind shifts. It carries the smell of river mud, that rich, living smell that says water has been here recently. You imagine the flood season, the anxious watching of water levels, the relief when the fields drink instead of drown. Flooding is a kind of rebirth too. The river brings silt, and the silt renews fertility. it also threatens to erase everything you built. The same event is both gift and danger. That duality sits at the center of Mesopotamian life. A more cautious explanation could be that many rebirth motifs in ancient texts are rooted in this agricultural reality. Life returns because the land returns. Order returns because the community forces it back into place. And yet, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can see the cycles in the evidence. We cannot always know how an individual, standing on these bricks, felt about their own personal existence. Did they imagine returning as themselves? Did they fear oblivion? Did they hope for memory? The tablets do not always say. Sometimes they only whisper. You let the whisper be enough. The night is gentle. The chant slows. The smoke thins. The stars remain, patient and indifferent, like the universe's version of a cat that refuses to respond when you call it. And in this high, quiet place, you hold 3 layers at once without forcing them to fight. The documented layer, calendars, seasons, temples, cycles of labor and ritual. The interpreted layer, the possibility that cyclical time helped people cope, helped societies renew, helped kings legitimize power. The imagined layer, the mood that you, too, might be moving through repeating patterns, not as a punishment, but as a rhythm you can learn to hear. Your breathing matches the chant now. In and out, return and release. The ziggurat stands under the sky like a steady thought, and you let your mind loosen, not trying to escape the cycle, just letting it rock you, like a boat on a river that has always known the way. You walk down into a street where the stones feel cooler and the shadows are deeper, and the air has that late-night quiet that makes even small noises sound important. A distant dog barks once, then decides the universe is not worth the effort. Someone stirs a pot in a courtyard, and the spoon taps the rim in a slow, sleepy rhythm. Your steps take you toward a doorway framed by carved wood and worn brick. And inside, a storyteller is gathering listeners the way a lantern gathers moths. Most historians agree that myth and ritual in ancient Mesopotamia were not just entertainment. They shaped how people understood power, death, fertility, and the fragile agreements between humans and the divine. That is the mainstream anchor. Tonight, the myth that drifts closest to your face is a descent story. The kind where someone goes down into darkness and comes back changed. It is one of the oldest narrative engines humans ever built, and it keeps running because it fits the shape of life. The storyteller's voice is low and steady, designed for an audience that has worked all day and wants their mind to settle. You lean against a wall, and you let the story wash over you like warm water. In the tale, a great figure chooses to descend. The name can vary in translation and later retelling, and the details can shift across time. But the structure is clear: a descent into an underworld, a confrontation with limits, a stripping away of status, and a return that is never simple. Archaeology suggests that underworld beliefs were widespread in Mesopotamian cultures, with the dead imagined to dwell in a shadowy realm that is not exactly punishment, not exactly reward, but a continuation in a diminished form. That is broadly accepted, even if specifics differ by era and city. Now, here comes the careful part. One interpretation is that these descent myths aren't literal travelogues of the soul. A careful reading might suggest they are psychological maps, teaching people how to survive grief, illness, humiliation, or political loss. The descent becomes a metaphor for falling apart, and the return becomes a metaphor for rejoining life. That is interpretation, not certainty. But it is a useful lens, especially when we are talking about cycles of rebirth. The storyteller describes gates, one gate, then another, then another. At each threshold, something is surrendered. A crown, a necklace, a ring, a garment. The figure becomes simpler, stripped of the symbols that say, "I am important." You can almost feel the audience lean in, because everyone understands the quiet fear behind it. If you lose your status, who are you? If you lose your job, your youth, your strength, your certainty, what remains? You notice how the story is built like a cycle, not a straight line. It goes down, then up. It loses, then regains. It ends, then restarts. The myth makes a promise without speaking it out loud. Even the worst descent can have a return, even if the return has conditions. A more cautious explanation could be that this is why these myths were so emotionally durable. They give the community a language for renewal that does not deny pain. They say, yes, you go down. Yes, you lose things. But you might come back. Now the mystery angle steps closer. But it keeps its voice soft. What if the eternal cycle of rebirth is not about you swapping bodies, but about you swapping selves? You are not the same person you were 5 years ago. You are not the same person you were yesterday morning before coffee. And that is not a joke. That is biology. You die in little ways. You shed versions of yourself. You return with slightly different edges. The storyteller's words describe a bargain, a replacement, a cost. Some versions of the descent myth include a swap, a trade that allows the figure to return while another takes their place. Most historians agree that themes of substitution appear in multiple Mesopotamian narratives, often tied to ideas about balance and cosmic accounting. If something returns, something else may be demanded. This is not a cheerful hallmark system. This is an ancient world where order is maintained through exchanges that can feel harsh. And yet, because we are keeping this sleep friendly, we hold it gently. We do not lean into fear. We let it be a calm puzzle. The cycle does not have to be cruel to be meaningful. The idea of a cost can also be interpreted as a lesson. Change asks something of you. Renewal is not free. If you want a new life, you may have to release an old habit. If you want peace, you may have to surrender the satisfaction of being right. If you want sleep, you may have to put the phone down. Yes, I know. Tragic. Historians still argue whether these myths were primarily tied to seasonal agricultural symbolism, like vegetation dying and returning, or whether they functioned more as political and theological narratives about divine hierarchy and temple power. The debate matters because it keeps the story from becoming a single answer. It stays a layered thing, the way good bedtime stories should. You can listen from one angle and see the harvest. You can listen from another angle and see a court of gods. You can listen from another angle and see your own heart, learning how to survive. The storyteller pauses to sip water. The room shifts. Someone coughs. A child fidgets. and then finally settles, defeated by sleep. You feel your own body soften too, because repetitive narratives do that. They rock you. They say the same shape again and again until your nervous system believes it. A fringe idea proposes that descent myths encode hidden instructions for spiritual escape, like a map for navigating a literal afterlife bureaucracy. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up in modern spiritual conversations, because people love the idea of a secret door. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if. What if the gates are not only mythic gates, but mental checkpoints? The moments in life where you decide whether to cling to your identity or let it loosen. You imagine standing at one of those gates. The guard asks you for your crown, and you realize your crown is not gold. It is your obsession with productivity, or your need to be liked, or your habit of replaying the same worry at 2 a.m. The guard holds out a hand. You sigh. You hand it over. You step forward lighter. That is the kind of rebirth that does not require supernatural mechanics. It requires honesty. The storyteller returns to the underworld itself. It is described as dusty, dim, a place where the dead live on remnants. That aligns with a mainstream understanding that Mesopotamian underworld concepts were often bleak compared to later traditions that emphasize reward and punishment. The dead are not soaring. They are existing in a shadowy continuity, offerings from the living matter. Memory matters. Names matter. One interpretation is that this bleakness makes the return motif even more potent. If the underworld is a diminished continuity, then any return to the surface feels like a rebirth, even if it is temporary. The story makes you appreciate breath, warmth, and food, like it is all borrowed. Now your mind drifts to the phrase, eternal cycle. Eternal can sound oppressive, like you are stuck on a treadmill forever. But what if the ancient imagination treated the cycle as the only stable thing? In a world with floods, droughts, wars, and sudden political shifts, the cycle is what you can trust. The sun returns, the moon returns, the season returns, the story returns. You return, not as the same you, but as a you who has survived another descent into tiredness and come back out. A listener in the room asks a question, softly. The storyteller answers with a parable about humility. The moral is simple. Even the powerful are brought low. Even the lowly may rise. The wheel turns. You notice how this becomes a social philosophy. Rebirth is not only personal, it is political. It is the idea that status is not fixed, that fortune changes, that the city itself can be rebuilt. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian cities experience cycles of growth and destruction across centuries, with layers of rebuilding piling atop older layers. That physical layering is literal rebirth in brick and ash. You can stand on a street and know there are older streets beneath it, sleeping. And the cinematic what if arrives like a slow breeze. What if the descent myth is not about a single goddess or hero at all, but about the city? The city descends into ruin. Gates close. Symbols are stripped. Then, somehow, people return. They carry baskets. They rebuild walls. They relight lamps. The city is reborn, and the story is reborn with it. The myth is not a report. It is a pattern that can be applied again and again, like a stamp pressed into fresh clay. You feel your eyelids grow heavy. The storyteller's voice becomes a river. You do not need to hold every detail. You can let it pass through you and still leave something behind. But one more development slides in, just to keep your mind gently engaged. Consider how the story insists on transformation. The returning figure is not simply restored to the exact previous state. There is knowledge gained, a shift in balance, a lingering mark. One interpretation is that this is the key difference between repetition and rebirth. Repetition can be mindless. Rebirth suggests change. So if someone says, "We're trapped in an eternal cycle," you can soften the word trapped. You can imagine the cycle as a spiral. Each descent teaches. Each return adjusts. Each loop offers a chance to become slightly kinder, slightly less reactive, slightly more awake to your own patterns. That is not ancient doctrine written neatly on a tablet. That is a modern interpretation inspired by ancient narrative structure. To be clear, this is debated, and we are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The storyteller ends the tale not with fireworks, but with a quiet line about balance being restored, at least for now. The listeners breathe out, like they have been holding tension without noticing. Someone smiles. Someone stands slowly, joints creaking. Sleep begins to claim the room like a polite fog. You step back into the street. The night air touches your face. The stars watch without comment. And inside you, the descent and return keeps echoing, not as a threat, but as a lullaby shaped like a loop. You let it be a gentle reminder. You can go down into darkness, and you can come back. And you can do it more than once. And each time, you might return a little more yourself. You drift toward the river, guided by the faint shimmer of moonlight on moving water and the soft, wet smell of reeds. The city behind you is still awake in pockets, little islands of lamplight. But out here the world feels wider. Frogs sing in the shallows like they are trying to outvote each other. A heron stands perfectly still, pretending it is not judging you. The river itself murmurs in a steady tone, not loud, not dramatic, just persistent, like it has been practicing this sound for thousands of years, and has no intention of changing its routine. Most historians agree that life in southern Mesopotamia depended on rivers that could be generous and dangerous at the same time, and that floods could both fertilize fields and destroy settlements. That is the documented anchor. People watched water levels the way you watch a weather app before a trip, except their forecast was anxiety, memory, and whatever the sky happened to be doing. You walk along a levee, a raised path of packed earth, and you notice how carefully the landscape is engineered. Channels branch like veins. Banks are reinforced. Gates and sluices are simple but meaningful technologies. Archaeology suggests that irrigation systems were essential to agriculture here, and managing them required organized labor. The river is not just nature. It is a relationship, maintained by constant effort. And then, the river reminds you of its other face. A wind shifts, and the water's surface breaks into restless little ridges. The sound changes. It is still gentle, but there is a low undertone that makes your body pay attention. Your mind slides into a communal memory, not your personal memory, but the kind that lives in stories and warnings. Flood. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian flood stories exist across multiple cultures and periods, often reflecting real experiences of river disasters. The evidence we do have points to floods being a recurring crisis that shaped settlement patterns and collective imagination. That is mainstream. And now the theme of rebirth steps forward in a new costume, wearing wet clothes and carrying a shovel. A flood is a reset button you did not ask for. It erases boundaries. It knocks down walls. It turns streets into canals. It makes the familiar unfamiliar. And then, after it passes, it leaves silt, a fresh layer of fertile mud that can make next season's crops stronger. Destruction and renewal arrive in one package. Like a delivery you did not order that somehow contains both broken glass and a gift card. You imagine villagers watching water rise, moving supplies higher, carrying children, animals, pots, bundles of reeds. No gore, no panic, just the sober urgency of people who know the river does what it does. They have practiced this drill in their minds for years. They have stories about it. They have prayers for it. They have jokes about it too. Because humans will make jokes even while carrying a goat on their shoulders, especially while carrying a goat on their shoulders. One interpretation is that flood stories became a symbolic way to talk about human helplessness and resilience. A careful reading might suggest the flood represents chaos, the force that reminds you are not in control. Then the rebuilding represents order, the force that says, you will try anyway. This is interpretation, not certainty. But it fits the emotional logic that shows up in many ancient narratives. Now the cinematic what if arrives, calm and misty. What if the eternal cycle of rebirth is not a mystical wheel, but a social one, built into the geography itself? The river rises, the city is damaged, the people rebuild, the river rises again. Life becomes a pattern of loss and restoration. The cycle is not an idea. It is the calendar written in water. You stop near a cluster of reeds. The stems sway softly. A small boat is tied to a post, rocking with a gentle creak. You put a hand on the rope and feel its rough fibers. It is a simple object, but it becomes a symbol tonight. It holds the boat in place, but it also allows movement. It is tension and freedom at once. You think? Maybe that is what the cycle is like. It keeps you near familiar ground, but it still lets you drift. In the distance, you see a line on a wall, a faint mark where water once reached. Someone has scratched it in to remember. Not a grand inscription, just a practical warning. This high. You imagine there are older lines beneath, from earlier floods, and maybe newer ones above, because nature is not sentimental. The evidence we do have points to communities recording and responding to environmental patterns through practical measures and ritual language. They adapt. They remember. They rebuild. Historians still argue whether the most famous flood narratives should be read primarily as mythic reflections of real disasters, or whether they also served political and theological purposes, like legitimizing a king's role as restorer of order. That debate matters here because it shows how a single event can become many meanings. A flood is water. A flood is memory. A flood is power. You picture a ruler standing on a rebuilt wall, not bragging loudly, but letting the city see that someone is in charge again, in a world where stability is fragile. Rebuilding is leadership. And this is where rebirth becomes political theatre, as well as communal labour. Her fringe idea proposes that ancient flood stories preserve the memory of one single, enormous global catastrophe that reset human civilization everywhere at once. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is complicated. But it persists because the human mind loves one big explanation, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It becomes a bedtime scale question. What if floods feel universal because they touch a universal fear? The fear of being washed away, forgotten, erased. You watch the river and realize something else. Rebirth is not always clean. It is muddy. It is effort. It is dragging broken reeds out of doorways and scraping silt off floors. It is deciding to plant again even after losing a harvest. It is waking up and trying again even after a bad year. The cycle is not romantic in the moment. It becomes meaningful in hindsight when you realize you survived it. A more cautious explanation could be that many ancient rebirth motifs are grounded in this lived reality. People did not need abstract philosophy to understand renewal. They watched it happen in the fields and in their own repairs. Every time a wall falls and is rebuilt, the city is reborn. Every time the river deposits fresh silt, the land is reborn. Every time a child grows up and takes over a task from an elder, the household is reborn. Not because a soul returned, but because continuity continued. And yet, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The emotional impact of repeated disasters can push a culture toward deeper metaphors. If your world is constantly resetting, you might start feeling like you are living inside a loop designed by something larger. You might whisper that the gods are turning a wheel, that humans are passengers, that nothing truly ends. It only changes shape. You crouch by the water's edge and dip your fingers in. The river is cool. It wakes you slightly, which is rude, but it also grounds you. Water moves, always moving. It never holds a single form. And still, it returns to the same path. It is both change and repetition. That paradox is the heart of this section, and it keeps your mind curious in a soft way. A fisherman passes quietly, his steps careful on the bank. He carries a net over his shoulder. He nods at you, not suspicious, just acknowledging another human sharing the night. He has probably done this walk 1,000 times. He knows where the bank is slippery, where the fish like to gather, where the reeds hide little surprises. Routine makes him skilled. Skill makes him calm. Calm helps him survive. The cycle of his work is not a trap. It is mastery. One interpretation is that cycles can be liberating when you learn them. A careful reading might suggest that the ancient relationship with the river was not only fear, but intimacy. They listened, they adjusted, they timed their labor, they built systems, they made offerings. They developed a culture that could breathe with the water's moods. Now the cinematic what if floats up like fog over the surface. What if you, too, are living with a river? Not of water, but of emotions and habits. Some days it rises, some days it recedes. Sometimes it floods your thoughts. Sometimes it leaves behind a fertile quiet. You cannot control it completely, but you can learn it. You can build levees, not of mud brick, but of boundaries, routines, and gentle self-awareness. You can let the cycle exist without letting it drown you. You stand and look along the river again. The moonlight makes the surface look like hammered metal. The frogs keep singing. The heron finally moves, slow and dignified, as if it is late for an appointment with destiny. You smile because the universe is always serious and silly at the same time. A small group of people gather near a shrine by the bank. They place small offerings, perhaps bread, perhaps a bit of beer, perhaps something symbolic. Most historians agree that offerings and ritual practices were woven into daily life in Mesopotamian communities. This is documented broadly. Even if the details vary, the ritual here is not about stopping the river. It is about negotiating with uncertainty, about acknowledging forces bigger than you. You watch the offering disappear into the dark water. It is not a payment that guarantees safety. It is a gesture, a way of saying, we see the pattern, and we are still here. And that, quietly, is the rebirth in this scene. Not a dramatic resurrection, not a cosmic escape, just the steady choice to remain, rebuild, and plant again. The river flows, the people adapt, the night continues, your breathing slows, the cycle turns, and instead of gripping it like a prison bar, you let it rock you, like water rocking a small boat tied to a rope that holds without strangling. You wander into a courtyard where the ground is swept clean and the air smells faintly of crushed herbs, like someone has tried to convince the night to behave. A single lamp hangs from a beam, throwing soft light onto a table covered in tablets and reeds. A clerk sits there with the posture of someone who has been asked to organize the universe, and is doing it with a stylus and pure stubbornness. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia produced king lists and royal inscriptions that blend record-keeping with political ideology. That is the mainstream anchor. These texts can preserve real names and sequences, but they can also shape a message about legitimacy, divine favor, and continuity. Tonight, you listen as if the list itself is a lullaby, a chain of names that tries to turn chaos into an orderly line. The clerk reads aloud, quietly, as if he is practicing for an audience that might never show up. Names of kings, cities associated with power, reigns that feel plausible, then reigns that stretch into lengths that make you blink, because some are described as lasting hundreds or even thousands of years. Your modern brain wants to say, okay, sure, with the same tone you use when someone claims they only spend 10 minutes a day on social media. But you keep it gentle, because the ancient text is not obligated to match modern expectations. The evidence we do have points to the Sumerian king list containing a mixture of historical and legendary elements. Most historians agree that it was compiled and copied over time, and that it serves a narrative function, presenting kingship as a single institution that moves from city to city. This is broadly accepted in scholarship, even though the exact motives and compilation history are debated. One interpretation is that the very structure of the list is a statement. Order continues. Even when cities fall, kingship returns. Even when dynasties end, the institution persists. That is rebirth in political form, not a soul returning, but a system reappearing, wearing different faces. The clerk pauses, then continues. The rhythm is hypnotic. name, city, years. Name, city, years. It feels like counting sheep. Except the sheep are royal titles and the pasture is history. You realize the list is doing something to your mind. It is making time feel like it has rails, and that can be comforting. If your life feels random, a list like this says, no, there is a sequence, but it can also be eerie. Because if everything is a sequence, you might wonder whether you're just another name waiting for a line. A careful reading might suggest that the extremely long reigns are symbolic, rather than literal, perhaps expressing the idea of an earlier age that feels vast, distant, and mythically powerful. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The long reigns might support the idea that the list is not only recording events, but constructing meaning, blending memory, myth, and political messaging. Historians still argue whether the Sumerian king list should be read primarily as propaganda to legitimize certain dynasties, or as a more complex cultural document that reflects genuine attempts to reconcile competing local histories into a single framework. That debate is part of what makes it interesting. It is not one thing. It is a text with a job, and the job is to make the world feel coherent. You look around the courtyard. On one wall, there is a small niche with a figurine or symbol, and beside it, a bowl that once held offerings. Even administrative work is not fully separated from ritual. In this world, authority is not merely human. It is imagined as connected to divine order. A king is not only a boss, he is a bridge, at least in the official story. Now the mystery angle slips in, carefully labeled as mystery. What if the list is not merely about kings? What if it is about recurrence itself? The way power repeats patterns. A city becomes dominant. It builds. It expands. It grows confident. Then it overreaches or is weakened. And another city rises. The list frames that as kingship moving like a torch passed along. A more cautious explanation could be that it reflects real shifts in regional power, simplified into a clean narrative. But the cinematic what if is irresistible in a bedtime way. What if the list is a spell designed to keep the cycle going, like speaking the names keeps the institution alive? What if forgetting a name breaks the chain? What if that is why humans have always kept lists, memorials, genealogies, and histories? Because remembering is a kind of rebirth. You pick up a tablet, careful not to smudge anything. It is heavier than it looks. Clay has weight, like responsibility. The marks are small, consistent. You imagine the effort it took to copy this, to check it, to store it. Writing is slow here. That slowness matters. It forces intention. In a world without instant edits, the act of recording becomes a commitment. One interpretation is that the king list also functions as a moral rhythm. It suggests that authority is not random, that the gods allow kingship to rest in certain places, then move it on. That creates a sense of fate, of cycles that are not controlled by ordinary people. If you are a farmer, you can influence your field, but can you influence where kingship goes? Probably not. So you learn to live with the big cycles and focus on the small ones. A fringe idea proposes that the long reigns and early kings hide coded information about lost epochs, perhaps even non-human rulers or forgotten civilizations. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up in modern speculation because numbers that look impossible invite imaginative solutions. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a sleepy thought experiment. What if the list is like a dream, compressing centuries into symbols that mean something more poetic than literal? You set the tablet down and listen again. The clerk's voice is steady. You notice how the list includes rises and falls without emotional commentary. It doesn't say, "This was tragic." It does not say, "This was glorious." It simply moves on. That neutrality is almost soothing. It mirrors how time treats you. Time does not clap when you succeed. Time does not gasp when you fail. It just continues. Now a new development enters, something that keeps the listener from getting bored, because it shifts the focus from kings to the people beneath them. Consider what it means to live in the shadow of these lists. If a king's reign is an era, then the lives of ordinary people are tiny cycles inside the bigger cycle. A person is born, learns a trade, marries, raises children, worries about food, and eventually becomes a memory. The king list does not mention them, but the city is made of them. What's broadly accepted is that many surviving tablets are not royal at all. They are administrative, legal, and personal records that show ordinary transactions and disputes. That is documented through archaeology and text collections. So while the king list is one kind of time, there is another time running underneath it. The time of daily life. And here is where the eternal rebirth idea can shift into something more human. You might not be reborn as a king, but in a household. Roles repeat. Someone always bakes bread. Someone always repairs tools. Someone always fetches water. The individual changes. The role remains. The role is reborn in each generation. That is a cycle that feels both comforting and strange. Comforting, because it means the household continues. Strange, because it suggests you are a temporary caretaker of something bigger. You notice a child in the courtyard, half asleep, leaning against a pillar. A parent lifts the child gently and carries them away. The clerk watches for a moment, then returns to his tablet. The scene is quiet, ordinary, and deeply ancient. The king list is being copied, but life is also happening. That is the real continuity. Historians still argue whether we should treat the king list as a primarily literary construction or as a historical source that must be carefully mined for reliable sequences. And while scholars debate, you can sit with the deeper mood it produces. It is a text obsessed with continuity. It cannot stand gaps. It fills gaps with myth if it must. It is allergic to disorder. One interpretation is that this hunger for continuity is exactly what creates the sensation of being trapped. If you insist the line must continue, then nothing can truly end. Every ending becomes a transition. Every collapse becomes a prelude. Kingship moves, returns, reappears. That can feel like comfort, or like a loop you cannot escape, depending on your mood. And then the cinematic what-if arrives, subtle as a breeze through reeds. What if you're reading your own life like a king list? You mark eras by who you were with, where you lived, what you feared, what you wanted. You say, in the time when I worked there, in the time when I lived in that apartment, in the time when I thought I had it figured out. Each era ends, another begins. You are the institution that moves from city to city, from self to self. You exhale, your shoulders drop. The clerk finishes a line and smooths the clay with a practiced thumb. Another name is set into the world. Another link in the chain is hardened against forgetting. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the list itself, the existence of texts that frame kingship as a continuous institution. The interpreted part is how we understand its purpose and symbolism. The imagined part is you feeling the list as a mirror, a reminder that repetition can be both structure and mystery. The lamp flickers, the night deepens, and the names continue, not as a trap, not as a promise, but as a steady rhythm that helps a human mind accept time. You slip into a temple hallway where the air is cooler and smells like stone dust, oil, and something faintly sweet, as if incense has soaked into the walls over many seasons. The floor is smooth under your feet, worn by generations of careful steps. A torch flickers in a sconce, and its light makes every shadow look like it is thinking. Most historians agree that the gods of Sumer and later Mesopotamia were central to civic life, with major deities linked to cosmic forces and city identity. That is the mainstream anchor. You are not wandering through a private chapel. You are moving through an institution that helps hold a society together, a place where religion, economy, and politics overlap like layers of clay pressed into one tablet. A priest approaches, not hurried, not suspicious, just curious. His robe rustles softly. He studies you the way a librarian studies someone who has wandered into the restricted section. He gestures for you to follow. And you do. Because in a dreamlike night journey you always follow the mysterious priest. It is practically a rule. Also, it beats doing your taxes. He leads you into a small chamber where figures and symbols rest in niches. Some are simple, some are elaborate. The priest speaks, and you catch names that at later ages will still echo. An, the sky; Enlil, the storm and authority; Enki, waters and wisdom; Inanna, love and power. Archaeology suggests that such deities had temples, offerings, and festivals, and that their myths were told and retold in changing forms. This is broadly accepted. The gods are not just characters. They are social reality. Now the cycle theme shifts into a new development, one that is not fields or floods or kings, but judgment and order. The priest describes the gods not as distant, but as administrators of balance. When things go wrong, people search for causes. Did someone break an oath? Did someone neglect a ritual? Did a ruler act unjustly? Did the city lose divine favor? In a world without modern science, meaning is often placed where you can reach it. In relationships, in moral behavior, in divine attention. One interpretation is that this worldview can make life feel like a loop of accountability. If you suffer, you look for what you did. If you prosper, you look for what you did. If a disaster hits, the community looks for what it did, even if the reason is simply weather or politics. The mind wants a moral thread. A careful reading might suggest that the cycle is partly this habit of returning to the question of responsibility. What caused it? What must be restored? What must be paid back? The priest places a small bowl on a low table. He pours a little liquid, perhaps water, perhaps beer, and the sound is delicate, like rain in a miniature. He says the gods notice exchange, offerings, vows, service. It is not always transactional in a simple way, but the relationship is framed as ongoing. The city gives, the gods give, the city fails, the gods withdraw, the city repairs, the gods return. That rhythm can look like rebirth, the return of favor, the return of stability. Now the mystery angle arrives, carefully labeled, because this is where modern speculation loves to play. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki, a term used in Mesopotamian texts for a group of deities associated with the underworld or divine assembly depending on context, are actually powerful overseers who manage human destiny like a system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often blends ancient names with modern concepts. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an atmospheric question. What if the feeling of being trapped in a cycle comes from imagining there is a courtroom above your life, stamping your forms and sending you back into the world again? The priest gestures to a carved scene, perhaps a seal impression, showing figures facing a seated deity. The imagery suggests order and hierarchy. Most historians agree that seal stones and reliefs often depict worshippers approaching gods, reflecting social and religious structures. That is documented through material culture. In these scenes, humans are small, the gods are large. The message is not subtle. You feel a mild chill, not fear, just the awe that comes from standing near an idea bigger than you. Then you remember you are safe in your bed, listening, and your brain relaxes again. The torch crackles. The priest speaks in a calm tone, and the chamber feels like a place where worries become quieter. Historians still argue whether certain divine groups in Mesopotamian religion, including terms like Anunnaki, had consistent meanings across time and place, or whether they shift significantly depending on genre, period, and local tradition. That debate is important because it keeps you from turning one word into one fixed claim. Names travel, meanings drift, categories blur. Even gods have branding issues. The priest describes a concept that feels like a wheel. Order must be maintained. If it slips, it must be restored. That restoration can involve ritual, confession, offerings, and social repair. One interpretation is that this creates a repeating cycle of guilt and cleansing, not in a modern, personal therapy sense, but in a communal sense. The city stumbles. The city cleans itself. The city tries again. Now the cinematic what if enters with a soft footstep. What if the divine courtroom is not literal, but internal? What if the gods are the way a culture talks about conscience? You do something wrong, and you cannot sleep. The next day, you make amends, and your chest feels lighter. That is a cycle too. Mistake, discomfort, repair, relief, repeat. In that lens, the Anunnaki are not aliens or hidden overseers, but a vocabulary for the human need to balance scales. The priest brings out a small figurine, not a toy, but a ritual object. He places it near the bowl. He explains that sometimes people use substitute figures in rituals, transferring impurity, illness, or misfortune symbolically. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian ritual practices that include symbolic transfers and protective objects, especially in later periods. and the roots of such thinking are part of a long tradition. This is mainstream enough as a general pattern, even if specific Sumerian examples vary. Here is the new twist for your mind tonight. Substitution rituals can feel like rebirth mechanics. Something bad is moved away, something clean is restored. The person is new again, at least socially and spiritually. One interpretation is that these rituals create the sensation of resetting a life without needing literal reincarnation. You are not dying and returning. You are being cleansed and continuing. A popular rumor claims that hidden within these practices is proof of a reincarnation system, like a cosmic paperwork loop. But that's a possibility, not a certainty, and not a widely accepted scholarly conclusion. The safer reading is that rituals address misfortune and anxiety by creating symbolic control. You cannot command storms, but you can perform a ritual that helps you feel less helpless. And sometimes that emotional shift changes how you act, which can change outcomes in practical ways. The priest invites you to sit. You lower yourself onto a woven mat. The texture is rough but comforting. Your breathing slows. The torchlight sways. The priest's voice becomes like a steady fan hum. He speaks about dreams, not in the sense of random brain noise, but as messages. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cultures took dreams seriously and developed traditions for interpreting them. This connects to the cycle theme in a fresh way. If dreams are messages, then sleep becomes a doorway where guidance can arrive, and waking becomes a return, a rebirth into the day with new information. One interpretation is that this makes every morning a small reincarnation. You go down into sleep, you meet symbols, you return with a different mood. Sometimes you return calmer. Sometimes you return with a weird dream about being late to an exam for a class you never took, which, honestly, is the most eternal cycle of all. The universe is huge, and yet your brain chooses that plotline again. Now the mystery theory can be framed gently. If a person believes dreams come from gods, it can feel like the gods are steering them through repeating lessons. You dream the same warning. You ignore it. You dream it again. The cycle persists until you change. What if the eternal rebirth is simply the universe repeating a lesson until you finally stop scrolling at midnight and drink water? I am joking, but only slightly. Historians still argue whether dream interpretation in Mesopotamia was primarily a personal spiritual practice, a professional diviner's craft, or a tool for political decision-making used by elites. The debate reminds you that even mystical elements can have practical uses. Power likes information. Even if the information is symbolic, the priest finally stands and offers a closing gesture, palms open as if releasing the conversation into the air. The chamber feels lighter. You feel lighter. Not because you learned a secret cosmic truth, but because you experienced a different way of framing life. A cycle of error and repair. A cycle of fear and reassurance. A cycle of sleep and waking. Each day, a small return. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the centrality of gods and ritual, the material culture of temples, the tradition of divination and dreams. Interpreted is the idea that these create psychological cycles of cleansing and renewal. Imagined is the cinematic possibility of a divine courtroom that feels like a rebirth machine. A story you can entertain without turning it into certainty. You rise from the mat. The torchlight flickers once more. The priest nods as if to say, "Keep walking, keep listening, keep your mind soft." And you step back into the night air with a calmer chest, as if you've been rinsed in meaning and returned to yourself. You find yourself in a small room that smells like crushed clay and old smoke, the kind of room where every sound feels padded. A single lamp burns low, and its flame makes the shadows waver as if they are breathing. In the center, a table holds scattered objects, a small bowl of water, a handful of pebbles, a bundle of reeds, and a stack of tablets wrapped in cloth. It feels less like a shrine and more like a workshop for meaning. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cultures developed extensive divination traditions, including omen texts that catalogue signs and their interpretations. That is the mainstream anchor. You are not in a place of random superstition, but in a place of organized pattern seeking. The goal is to read the world like a text, to treat events as messages that can be decoded. A practitioner sits opposite you, not theatrical, not spooky, just focused, like someone doing a serious job that requires patience. He sets the bowl of water in front of you and gestures for you to look. The water reflects the lamp. The reflection trembles with tiny ripples. He asks what you see. You could say, "I see water," because that is the honest answer, and also the type of answer that gets you politely escorted out of mystical workshops. Instead, you let your mind loosen. You see the flame's reflection splitting and rejoining. You see the surface becoming two surfaces, then one again. The practitioner nods as if this matters. One interpretation is that omen reading is not only about predicting the future, but about training attention. A careful reading might suggest that when you are taught to notice tiny signs, you become more aware of patterns in your life, and that awareness can change how you act. That is interpretation, not certainty, but it is a gentle way to understand why divination can feel powerful without claiming it is scientifically proven. It is possible that the value is less in the sign and more in the mind that learns to watch. Now the cycle theme enters as a new development through repetition of symbols. Omen lists are structured like loops. If this happens, then that follows. If a bird flies a certain way, it suggests something. If the moon looks strange, it suggests something. The world becomes a set of repeating correspondences. Once you learn them, you carry them everywhere, like a second set of eyes. The practitioner places pebbles on the table in a pattern. He moves one pebble slightly and watches you. It is subtle, but your brain reacts. You want to complete the pattern. You want symmetry. You want closure. That is the human mind at work, craving a return to order. And suddenly, the idea of an eternal cycle of rebirth feels less cosmic and more neurological. Your mind loves loops because loops feel like safety. Historians still argue whether the earliest omen traditions grew primarily out of temple priesthood routines, or whether they also pulled from household folk practices that were later formalized and written down. The debate matters because it shows how a culture can take private anxieties and build public systems to manage them. A worry becomes a method becomes a text becomes a tradition. The practitioner unrolls the cloth around the tablets. He traces a line of symbols with his finger, then looks up. His eyes are calm, almost kind. He is not promising you a perfect answer. He is offering you a way to hold uncertainty without choking on it. A more cautious explanation could be that many divination practices function as coping strategies in societies where uncertainty is high and control is limited. You cannot command the river. You cannot guarantee harvest. You cannot prevent illness. But you can interpret signs, perform rituals, make choices, and feel less helpless. That feeling can be a kind of rebirth, a return from panic to steadiness. Now the mystery angle slips in, carefully framed. A popular rumor claims that omen texts are actually fragments of a hidden instruction manual for escaping a soul cycle, like a coded guide disguised as prediction. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic thought. What if the signs are not about tomorrow's weather, but about the patterns that keep you repeating the same emotional seasons? The practitioner asks you about your dreams. He does not ask like a therapist. He asks like a technician. Dreams are data. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamians often treated dreams as meaningful and sometimes sought professional interpretation. This is documented in later texts and traditions, and the mindset can be traced through long periods. Dreams become part of the sign system. You think of a dream that repeats, the kind that shows up again and again. Maybe you are searching for a door. Maybe you are missing a train. Maybe you're trying to speak and nothing comes out. The practitioner listens, then taps a tablet gently, as if to say, repetition is not accidental. One interpretation is that recurring dreams might signal unresolved emotion, unresolved fear, unresolved desire. That is a modern lens, and it is not the only lens. An ancient lens might say, a god is repeating a message. Either way, the mechanism is similar. The mind or the world repeats until you notice. And here is a new twist that keeps your attention fresh. The practitioner explains that not every sign is doom. Some are simply reminders. A bird's call can mean pay attention. A strange cloud can mean slow down. A dream can mean rest. In this view, the cycle is not punishment. It is education. A fringe idea proposes that humans are deliberately kept in repeating loops by higher powers, and that dreams and omens are glitches in the system, little cracks where the truth leaks out. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is emotionally seductive, because it turns random suffering into a story with villains and hidden doors. If we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, we can enjoy the mood of it without turning it into a claim. What if the glitch is not cosmic at all, but simply the part of you that refuses to sleepwalk through your life? The practitioner offers you a small reed stylus and a fresh tablet of soft clay. He gestures for you to press a mark. You hesitate. Then press. A wedge appears. You press again, and another wedge joins it. You are writing, not in a meaningful language, but in a meaningful act. You are leaving a sign. It feels strangely intimate. You realize that writing is also a divination tool, not because the marks predict the future, but because they reveal your present. You can see how steady your hand is. You can see how impatient you are. You can see how you want the marks to look perfect. The tablet becomes a mirror. One interpretation is that the cycle of rebirth can be understood as the cycle of self-revision. You make a mark, you judge it, you adjust, you make another. Over time, the marks change. The you who makes them changes. The cycle repeats, but the pattern evolves. Historians still argue whether literacy in early Mesopotamia remained largely restricted to specialist scribes for long periods, or whether it spread more widely than we can easily measure based on surviving evidence. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine this room. Is it an elite workshop or a more common practice? Either way, the act of recording signs is powerful, and power invites mystery. The practitioner takes your tablet and tilts it toward the lamp. The marks catch the light. He nods. He says something like, "You will repeat what you do not understand, and you will change what you finally see. It is not a prophecy, it is a principle, and you feel it land inside you, gentle but real." Now the cinematic what-if comes in like a soft blanket. What if every repeating pattern in your life is an omen, not from the sky, but from your own behavior? You date the same kind of person. You sabotage the same opportunity. You chase the same approval. You fear the same rejection. The cycle continues until you read the sign correctly. In that view, rebirth is not a mystical return, but a moment of insight that breaks the loop. The practitioner covers the tablets again and stands. He does not send you away. He simply lets the room become quiet. The lamp's flame steadies. The bowl of water grows still. Your breathing grows slow. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the existence of omen traditions and the cultural seriousness of sign reading. Interpreted is the idea that these practices train attention and help people manage uncertainty. Imagined is the thought that signs might be cracks in a larger system, a playful possibility rather than a conclusion. You step out of the room with a calmer mind, carrying a new way of seeing repetition, not as a prison, but as a message that keeps knocking until you answer it. And as you walk, the night feels softer, as if the world itself is whispering, "Notice, notice, notice," and then rest. You enter a neighborhood where the streets are narrower and the sounds are quieter, as if the city is trying not to wake itself. A door creaks somewhere, then closes with a soft thump. A pot cools on a windowsill. The air carries the smell of wool, smoke, and something faintly sour, like fermented dough. You pass a small courtyard where someone has hung fresh cloth to dry, and the cloth stirs in the breeze like slow-moving ghosts that are, thankfully, just laundry. Most historians agree that in Sumer and later Mesopotamian societies, identity was strongly tied to household, lineage, and social role. That is the mainstream anchor. A person is not only an individual. A person is a son of, a daughter of, a worker of, a servant of a temple, a member of a household with obligations and protections. Names matter because they place you in a web. You step into a home where a family is gathered around a low table. A small lamp throws warm light onto bread, dates, and a bowl of something stew-like that smells better than it looks, which is honestly the ideal stew. The family doesn't stare at you as if you are an intruder. They barely react, as if you are a familiar presence passing through, like a breeze. A woman speaks a name, and the way she speaks, it makes you feel that the name is not just a label. It is a thread. The evidence we do have points to names appearing constantly on tablets, in contracts, in ration lists, in legal disputes, in witness statements. What's broadly accepted is that writing preserved people's names and roles in ways that outlasted them. That is documented. A name pressed into clay can outlive flesh by thousands of years, which is both comforting and slightly unsettling. Like realizing your embarrassing middle school nickname could be preserved forever if someone had bothered to write it down. One interpretation is that this is a kind of rebirth, not a literal soul returning, but a person returning as a reference, as a remembered presence. When your name is spoken, something of you reappears. When your name is read, your existence flickers again in someone else's mind. A careful reading might suggest that ancient concerns about legacy and memory are a response to how final death can feel. If you cannot return physically, you return socially through story, lineage, and record. In the corner of the room, a small area is set aside, not with grand statues, but with simple objects, a bowl, perhaps a figurine, perhaps a small stand for offerings. Archaeology suggests that household ritual practices existed alongside temple cults, with families maintaining their own traditions of protection and remembrance. The exact forms vary, and the evidence is not always complete. But the pattern is widely accepted. A child reaches toward the small setup and is gently redirected by an elder, not harshly, just with that universal adult gesture that says, "Not now, tiny chaos engine." The elder murmurs a name, maybe the name of an ancestor. The tone is soft, like a lullaby. And in that moment, you feel the cycle of rebirth in a new way, not through gods or kings, but through family continuity. Historians still argue whether beliefs about the dead in early Mesopotamia should be understood mainly through formal religious texts, or whether everyday household practices reveal a more personal, varied relationship with ancestors and spirits than official sources suggest. That debate matters because it shapes the emotional picture. Are people resigned? Are they hopeful? Are they afraid? Are they simply practical? The truth may be a mix, and the evidence does not always let us hear every voice. Now the mystery angle arrives, gentle and clearly labelled. A popular rumour claims that some ancient names were chosen to anchor as a returning soul, as if the name itself could call a spirit back into the family line. This idea is not widely accepted as a proven ancient doctrine, and the evidence is thin. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if. What if the family repeats names not only to honour memory, but to invite a familiar essence to return? You watch the family pass bread. The child receives a piece. The elder smiles. A small act, but it repeats across generations. A more cautious explanation could be that what we call rebirth is often simply role continuity. Someone always becomes the baker. Someone always becomes the storyteller. Someone always becomes the caretaker. The individual changes. The function continues. In a world that values household stability, this continuity is survival. You move into another room where textiles are stored, bundles of wool and linen. The smell is dry and earthy. A woman runs her fingers over a woven pattern and explains it to a younger person, showing how to keep the tension even, how to avoid a mistake that will unravel everything later. The teaching itself is a kind of rebirth. Skill moves from mind to mind. The pattern is repeated. The hands change. The craft persists. One interpretation is that cultures are reborn continuously through teaching, not because souls recycle, but because knowledge does. This raises the possibility that ancient obsession with record-keeping and tradition is not merely conservative. It is a way of ensuring that the community can restart after loss. If disaster strikes, you can rebuild, because someone remembers how. The household becomes a little archive. Now the cinematic what-if turns quieter, more intimate. What if you are an archive, too? You carry gestures from your parents, phrases you swore you would never say, and then suddenly say. The exact same tone, the exact same eye roll. You are reborn as your own ancestor in small ways. It is funny and spooky at once, like realizing you have become the adult you used to complain about. The cycle is real, and the evidence is your own reflection. A messenger arrives at the doorway with a tablet. The family's mood shifts slightly. Business? Obligation? The tablet is read aloud. It concerns a loan, a marriage arrangement, a dispute about land. Most historians agree that legal and economic texts reveal the importance of contracts and witnesses, and that family alliances were part of social structure. That is documented. And here is another way the cycle works. Families weave themselves into other families, repeating social patterns, reinforcing networks, renewing the city's structure. Historians still argue whether we should interpret ancient legal texts as describing typical everyday practice, or whether they represent exceptional cases that ended up recorded precisely because they were disputed. The debate matters because it reminds you not to treat surviving evidence as a perfect mirror. What we have is a partial set of windows. Still, through those windows, you can see people negotiating continuity, protecting property, arranging futures. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient lineages preserved secret knowledge about a true cycle of rebirth, passed down quietly inside families and hidden from public ritual. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often rests on imagination more than evidence. But if we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime mystery. What if the real Sumerian secret is not written on public tablets, but whispered in kitchens, passed along with recipes and warnings? You notice a small object on a shelf, a simple bead necklace. It looks old, worn smooth. Someone touches it absent-mindedly while speaking, like a grounding habit. That small detail becomes a symbol tonight. Objects can carry memory. Objects pass through hands. A bead worn by one person can be worn by another. The object is reborn in each new life it touches, even if the people change. One interpretation is that this is why grave goods and offerings mattered, not necessarily because the dead needed items in a literal sense, but Because objects help the living maintain a relationship with what is gone. The relationship is the cycle. Remember, offer, speak the name, continue. The cycle is not always about escape. It is about connection. A child grows sleepy. The family begins to settle. Someone hums a simple melody. The lamp is turned lower. The room becomes softer. You feel your own thoughts slow, like they are being wrapped in cloth and placed gently on a shelf. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the importance of households, names on tablets, and family structures. Interpreted is the idea that memory and role continuity function as rebirth. Imagined is the possibility that names might call essence back. A poetic what if rather than a conclusion. You step back into the narrow street. The city around you feels like a living organism made of repeating gestures. Bread being passed, names being spoken, skills being taught, lamps being lit and dimmed. The cycle continues, not as a trap, but as a quiet thread that holds people together across time. You wander into a place that feels less like a neighborhood and more like a wound in the city. An open patch of ground where broken brick, scattered pottery, and half-buried fragments lie under moonlight. The air smells dusty, and the silence has weight. Here, the city's normal rhythm pauses, as if even the insects are listening. Most historians agree that the ancient record is incomplete because so much was lost to decay, breakage, reuse of materials, looting, and the simple fact that time is not gentle. That is the mainstream anchor. What survives is not everything. It is what happened to be buried in a way that protected it, or what was stored and forgotten, or what was dropped and covered. The evidence we do have points to enormous gaps, and those gaps invite imagination. You kneel and pick up a shard of clay tablet, careful, as if it might crumble into dust the moment you breathe wrong. A few wedge marks remain, like half a sentence interrupted. The fragment is the kind of thing that makes your mind itch. You want to know the rest. You want closure. You want the missing line that makes it all make sense. One interpretation is that missing texts create cycles of interpretation. Scholars reconstruct. Readers speculate. Theories rise, fall, and rise again. A careful reading might suggest that the eternal cycle is not only in ancient belief, but in modern obsession. Every generation looks at the same fragments and asks new questions, often shaped by its own fears and desires. The past is reborn in new forms of explanation. You notice something else. Broken tablets are still tablets, even incomplete. They carry authority. A fragment can shape a whole narrative if people want it to. That is where mystery creeps in, not necessarily in the ancient world, but in our relationship with it. A popular rumor claims that certain crucial tablets exist but are hidden away, locked in private collections, sealed in vaults, awaiting for the right time to be revealed. This idea isn't widely accepted as a confirmed fact, and it often grows in the shadowy space where mistrust and romance overlap. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic what if. What if the missing line is missing on purpose, because the story is not supposed to end? You move deeper into the rubble field. You find pottery bits, smooth stones, a broken seal impression. You imagine how many lives passed through this area, how many hands touched these objects, how many conversations happened here. Yes, then a collapse, a fire, a flood, a raid, or simply abandonment. The city shifts, and this place becomes buried time. Archaeology suggests that many Mesopotamian sites are layered, with new building phases constructed atop older ruins, creating stratified mounds over centuries. That is broadly accepted. Each layer is a kind of rebirth. A street becomes a foundation. A collapsed wall becomes fill. A new courtyard is laid over old ash. The city does not just continue. It reincarnates in architecture. Historians still argue whether certain dramatic breaks in the archaeological record at specific sites reflect sudden, catastrophic events, or whether they represent slower transitions, relocations, and changes in material culture that can look abrupt simply because evidence is uneven. That debate matters because it reminds you not to turn every gap into a disaster story. Sometimes the missing line is missing because people moved, not because the world ended. Now the cycle theme gains a new flavor, the cycle of storytelling itself. When evidence is incomplete, storytellers fill it. That can be responsible or reckless. Responsible storytelling says, here is what is document, here is what is interpretation, here is what we are imagining. Reckless storytelling says, I found the secret truth, and then sells it in a dramatic voice with ominous music. We are not doing that tonight. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You find a spot where several fragments lie together as if they once belonged to the same tablet. The marks are too few to read, but your mind supplies possible words, a name, a number, a prayer, a warning, a love note. Yes, love notes can exist on clay too, and honestly, that is adorable. Imagine being so committed that you carve your feelings into mud. That is either romance or a very intense form of journaling. One interpretation is that the cycle of rebirth can be found in how texts are copied. A scribe copies an older tablet, preserving it. Then later, another scribe copies the copy. Over time, errors creep in, phrases shift, new lines get added, old lines get simplified. The text survives by changing. It is reborn in each new copy, not identical, but continuous. Now the mystery angle appears, softly labelled. A fringe idea proposes that later cultures projected their own concepts, including more developed ideas of soul travel or reincarnation, back onto earlier Sumerian material, and that modern readers then project even more. This raises the possibility that the rebirth trap is partly a mirror effect. The ancient text becomes a screen for later hopes and fears. If we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, we can enjoy the mystery without mistaking it for certainty. You stand and look across the rubble. The moonlight makes everything look equal, as if broken pottery and broken bricks are all the same. But you know they are not. Each piece once had a purpose. Each piece was part of someone's day. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient people likely thought about continuity in many ways at once. Seasonal cycles, political cycles, social roles, memory, and ritual renewals. Whether they imagined a literal reincarnation loop is not a simple yes or no based on surviving evidence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Then you notice a small pit where someone has been digging. An older excavation cut. The edges are clean. The soil color changes in layers. You can almost feel the excitement of the moment when an object emerges. The careful brushing, the held breath. Discovery is a kind of rebirth too. An object that slept underground returns to the light. Its meaning is uncertain at first, then argued over, then placed into narratives. Historians still argue whether the public fascination with ancient secrets reflects genuine curiosity, or whether it often reveals modern anxieties about control, destiny, and hidden systems. The debate is not only academic, it is emotional. People want the past to explain why their life feels repetitive. They want an ancient authority to say, yes, you are trapped. Or, no, you are free. But the ancient fragments rarely give clean answers. They give textures. Now the cinematic what if arrives with a calmer tone. What if the reason you feel trapped in cycles is not because a god stamped your paperwork, but because you're standing in the middle of incomplete information, just like an archaeologist holding a fragment? You make meaning from what you have. You fill gaps. You assume patterns. You repeat what you assume. The cycle continues until you realize you have been writing the missing line yourself. You pick up one last fragment. It is small, barely the size of your palm. The marks on it could be anything, but you decide to treat it as a symbol, not a proven message, not a decoded prophecy, but a reminder that mystery lives where evidence breaks. You can respond to mystery with fear, or with curiosity. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the fragmentary nature of the archaeological record and the layered rebuilding of sites. Interpreted is the idea that gaps create cycles of explanation and projection. Imagined is the possibility of hidden tablets or deliberate omission. A cinematic mood, rather than a claim, you place the fragment back where you found it. You stand. The night wind moves across the rubble field like a slow hand smoothing a blanket. The city's lights flicker in the distance, and your mind, rather than racing for a final answer, begins to settle into the softer truth. Sometimes the cycle is not in the world. Sometimes it is in the way you keep asking the same question until your own heart finally changes the way it listens. You arrive at a quiet threshold where the city's sounds thin out and the night feels like a soft cloth pulled across the world. The ground under your feet is smoother here, as if many people have walked the same path slowly, thinking the same thoughts. A low wall runs along the edge of a canal, and the water reflects stars in broken little pieces. Everything feels calm, but not empty. Calm, like a room after laughter, when the air still remembers it. Most historians agree that Sumer's legacy didn't vanish when its cities changed hands, but flowed into later Mesopotamian cultures through language, myth, administration, and the scribal tradition. That is the mainstream anchor. A civilization is not a single flame that goes out. It is a set of embers that move from hearth to hearth, sometimes glowing bright, sometimes dim, but still capable of warming the mind centuries later. Tonight, The question is not whether a literal reincarnation loop was officially taught by Sumerian priests as a neat doctrine. The evidence we do have points more strongly to cycles of time, ritual renewal, social continuity, and layered meanings around death and memory than to a clear, universal belief that you return again and again as the same kind of soul traveler. That is a more cautious explanation, and it keeps the solid ground separate from the mist. But you are also not here for a courtroom verdict. You are here for a feeling. You are here because repetition in life can feel spooky, and the old world gives you symbols to talk about it. You sit on the low wall and let your feet dangle. The canal water moves slowly. Somewhere, a nightbird calls once, then stops. Like it remembered it left the stove on. You breathe in and out, and you notice how the breath itself is a cycle that never asks permission. Your body doesn't panic about repetition. It relies on it. Historians still argue whether ancient Mesopotamian concepts of fate and divine will should be understood as fixed determinism, or as a more flexible negotiation where humans could influence outcomes through ritual, ethics, and practical action. That debate matters because it changes the emotional meaning of the cycle. If everything is fixed, cycles feel like chains. If life is negotiated, cycles feel like patterns you can learn and bend. One interpretation is that the eternal cycle of rebirth can be understood as a metaphor for recurring choices. You keep meeting the same temptation, the same fear, the same kind of relationship problem, the same self-doubt, wearing a different outfit. The scene changes. The feeling repeats. If you want to be spooked in a safe bedtime way, you can imagine the universe as a patient teacher who keeps handing you the same lesson until you finally stop answering it with the same habit. A fringe idea proposes that there is a literal mechanism behind the feeling, a hidden system that returns you again and again with memory wiped, like a cosmic reset button. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is not strong evidence tying it directly to standard Sumerian doctrine. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an interesting mood. What if the cycle is real, and the only clue you get is the strange familiarity of your own patterns? You watch a small ripple travel across the canal. It begins from a tiny disturbance. Maybe a fish, maybe a falling leaf. The ripple expands, touches the wall, and fades. Another ripple follows later. The water keeps doing this, and it never gets bored. The canal does not demand novelty. It simply moves. A more cautious explanation could be that humans demand novelty because our minds get anxious in stillness. When life repeats, we can start calling it a trap. But repetition is also how we heal. You practice calm. You practice kindness. You practice letting go. You do not do it once. You do it many times. That is not imprisonment. That is training. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian texts often emphasize maintaining order, honoring obligations, and renewing social and divine relationships through regular practice. That is broadly accepted. In that context, the cycle is a feature, not a bug. It is how a city stays a city, how a household stays a household, how a person stays connected to others. Now comes a new development that is practical, not preachy, and still fits the theme. Imagine you've been treating your own repeated days as evidence you are stuck. What if you try treating them as evidence you are building something? A day repeated is a brick repeated. Enough bricks become a wall. Enough small routines become a life. In that lens, rebirth is not waiting for you after death. It is happening inside your habits, in the way you remake yourself each morning. A careful reading might suggest that ancient rituals worked the same way. They did not rely on one dramatic moment. They relied on return. The yearly festival, the daily offering, the repeated prayers, the repeated maintenance of canals and walls. The point was not to escape repetition. The point was to use repetition to keep chaos from swallowing everything. And yet, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot interview a Sumerian farmer at midnight and ask, "Do you feel trapped in a cycle?" We can only listen to the echoes in the texts, and the material remains. And then, notice how those echoes vibrate inside us. So you let yourself hold the truth ladder gently, the way you hold a warm mug without gripping too hard. Documented. There were cycles of seasons, rituals, political renewal, and social roles. And texts and archaeology show a culture deeply engaged with maintaining continuity. Interpreted. Those cycles may have shaped how people understood meaning, fate, responsibility, and restoration, making rebirth a powerful metaphor, even when not literal. Imagined. What if some deeper loop exists, and the ancient stories are just the faintest reflection of it, like moonlight on canal water? You do not need to choose one and crush the others. You can let them coexist. That is how bedtime thinking works. You let ideas float without needing to nail them to a wall. The night grows softer. The canal's smell is cool and earthy. Your shoulders drop. Your jaw loosens. You feel the way a calm moment can make time feel circular. Because when you are calm, you stop measuring seconds like they are coins. Now the wind down begins, slow and gentle, like a blanket being pulled up. You imagine the city settling, lamps dimming, doors closing, a last murmured conversation fading into silence. Somewhere, someone lies down on a mat and exhales the whole day. Somewhere, a child curls into sleep and dreams of running through bright streets that never quite match waking streets. Somewhere, an old person closes their eyes and holds a name in their mind, not as a spell, just as love. The canal water keeps moving. The stars keep hanging in place, patient and quiet. Your breathing becomes the simplest rhythm, the one you were born with, and the one that will carry you through this night. You let the idea of the cycle become soothing rather than frightening. A circle can be a trap if you cannot see it. But a circle can also be a cradle. It can rock you. It can remind you that return is possible, that rest is possible, that even if tomorrow looks like today in some ways, you will still be slightly different, because you're always changing in tiny, quiet increments. Historians still argue whether the deepest purpose of ancient myth is to explain the world, to control it, or simply to comfort people living inside uncertainty. You do not have to solve that tonight. You can let the myths do what they have always done, which is to sit beside you in the dark and say, "You are not alone in feeling patterns. You are not the first to wonder if life repeats. And you are allowed to rest, even without a final answer." Your eyes feel heavy now. Your thoughts slow. The canal's reflection blurs, and the stars become softer points of light. The night air cools your skin in a gentle way. The world does not demand anything from you right now. And in this quiet, you let yourself believe a simple, calming possibility. Even if life is made of cycles, you can meet them with softness. You can let repetition be a lullaby instead of a cage. You can let each breath be a small return, each exhale a release, each moment a tiny rebirth into calm. You sit a little longer, and then you let the scene fade, not abruptly, but gradually, like a lamp turned down until the glow becomes warmth without light. End of script. Sweeter dreams.